So, Bathsheba Spooner. Better said as Bathsheba Ruggles Spooner. And before we talk about Bathsheba, we should make clear exactly who her father was. Thomas Ruggles was an extremely important member of Massachusetts Colonial Assembly. He had served as Speaker of the Colonial Assembly on several occasions, and in the mid-1760s was actually a delegate to the Stamp Act Congress. And the Stamp Act Congress in New York City, of course, was about a decade before the Revolution breaks out, and they didn't like the Stamp Act and wrote a bunch of grievances to the king in England and Parliament, and it worked. And then 10 years later, at the First Continental Congress, they thought the same thing would work, and it didn't work later on. But the important thing about Thomas Ruggles is he went there very much against the idea of having a Stamp Act Congress at all. He was uber loyal to the king. He didn't like the fact that people were even pretending to lay grievances at the feet of His Majesty. So he went to the Stamp Act Congress, tried to ruin it. They still got it. Like I said, they would send out letters to the 3 letters, one to the king, one to the House of Lords, one to the House of Commons. And Thomas Ruggles didn't sign any of them. When the Revolutionary War breaks out, Thomas Ruggles ends up siding with the Loyalists, obviously, and leads Loyalists in the field, though he's an older man at that point, and quickly evacuates to Nova Scotia, where he actually becomes a founder of Nova Scotia at the end of his life. Now, when he leaves behind several family members, mostly daughters who at this point have been married off, and one of them was Bathsheba Spooner. So Bathsheba Ruggles, back in the mid-1760s, just after her daddy was at the Stamp Act Congress, Bathsheba Ruggles marries a man named Joshua Spooner. And she becomes Bathsheba Ruggles Spooner, or as one might say, Bathsheba Spooner. Joshua Spooner, Bathsheba's husband, was a moderately wealthy farmer. He came from a pretty good background, his family, and he was a farmer now. And when the hostilities began for the American Revolution 10 years later, Joshua joins the Continental Army. He becomes a Continental soldier. Bathsheba, for her part, helped nurse a young boy named Ezra Ross back from health. There was a 16-year-old Continental Army soldier named Ezra Ross who had been sick, and he was friendly with Joshua Spooner, Bathsheba's husband, and Bathsheba agreed with her husband, hey, I'll take care of this kid, I'll make him healthy again. And boy, did she take care of him. She made him nice and healthy, and then they had a little fling. And Bathsheba became pregnant, and the assumption is it was Ezra's child. Now, I want to note at this point, Bathsheba's 32 years old, so Ezra Ross is half her age. This soldier, I shouldn't say soldier, he was a soldier, but this child, essentially, seems to have gotten her pregnant. Now, Bathsheba seems to, I don't want to say lose her mind, but, well, yeah, probably, because she falls head over heels for this young Ezra boy, and she tries to get him to kill her husband, presumably so that they could live together in bliss. Now, Ezra actually takes a bottle, I believe it was nitric acid, with him because he was friendly with her husband, Joshua. He looked at him as kind of a mentor, and they would travel together around Massachusetts between going warring. And he actually brought poison to poison Joshua, but couldn't go through with it and backs out. And then about this time, Bathsheba's not super happy that Ezra backed out of murdering her husband, but she becomes friendly with 2 former British soldiers who have deserted the British Army. And she becomes friendly with these lowlifes, and she convinces them to kill her husband. And she writes to Ezra and says, hey, I found people to do it. If you won't do it, I found people who will. So Ezra kind of runs over after he gets that letter and says, hey, what's going on here? And he gets there pretty much just in time for Joshua to come home and one of the British soldiers to kill him. They just essentially attack him and beat him half to death. And then the 2 British soldiers, Bathsheba and Ezra, hide the body, and they hide it in a well not far enough away. And Bathsheba decides to reward the British soldiers by giving them booze and giving them a bunch of money from her husband's box and a bunch of his belongings, clothes and shoe buckles and whatnot, and a horse. And the soldiers take the horse on the road, and they go to a tavern, and they're already drunk, and they're looking like, look at these sweet shoe buckles I got. And people pretty much right away were like, no way, that's Joshua Spooner's shoe buckles. Did you steal it? They start investigating. They find the body almost right away. It's a handful of days, and the jig is up. And everyone involved is arrested. All four parties: the two British officers, Bathsheba Spooner, and Ezra Ross, the 16-year-old who found himself in this situation. Anyway, they end up going to trial. And interestingly enough, the trial is prosecuted by Robert Treat Paine, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And this is in 1778, so just 2 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Robert Treat Paine's back in Massachusetts prosecuting this murder trial. Very, very interestingly, and 1000% by chance, the defense attorney was Levi Lincoln Sr., who I've talked about now in my last two videos, or were my last two founders. Levi Lincoln Sr. just happened to appear in this discussion also as the defense attorney. Now, he doesn't defend anyone very well except the 16-year-old Levi Lincoln, who he basically says he's just a kid. He backed out of the murder once. He was just kind of around for it this time. There's really no reason for him to be tried and hanged for this crime when obviously these other grown-ups were in charge of it. Now, what ends up happening is they all get convicted, even the Ezra Ross. They're like, well, if he's old enough to serve in the army at 16, he's old enough to be hung for his crimes. And that is exactly what happened. Now, Bathsheba actually tries to prevent, or I'll say stay her execution for a while until her child can be born. She says she could feel the child moving around in there, but other than that, it was apparently hard to tell that she was pregnant, and people disagreed with her. And they had I think it was like 12 doctors and midwives came to check her out and see if she was pregnant, and they decided she wasn't. And then she had an appeal to have more doctors come, including her brother-in-law, who was the brother of Joshua Spooner, who was murdered, was one of the physicians who checked her out to see if she was really pregnant. And he obviously would have wanted his brother's baby to be born, though, again, this baby was probably Ezra Ross's. Either way, they decide she's not pregnant, and they hang her anyway. And it was only during the autopsy that they found out, yes, she actually was probably about 5 months pregnant. So sorry, baby, whoopsie daisy. And she was hung, interestingly enough, she was hung on January 2nd, 1778. So 2 years to the day of the independence, just to put some perspective on what was going on in Massachusetts and how they were charging and going through crimes and convicting felons of crimes at the peak of the American Revolutionary War. And with this, Bathsheba Ruggles Spooner becomes the first woman hanged in the United States, the newly independent United States.